Welcome to Day 3 of Agenda 2022, the Pearson Center's fall conference on the priorities that government and Parliament should address in 2022 and beyond. My name is Francesca Iacorto, and I'm a board member of the Pearson Center, and I'm also the Senior Director of Public Affairs at the National Airlines Council of Canada. Let me begin by acknowledging that we are meeting virtually on the land of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We pay tribute to Indigenous peoples across the country and their ancestors for their tremendous contributions to Canada. As you know, the Pearson Center is a leading progressive think tank that addresses the large economic and social challenges of the day. We are proud to say that we are the only think tank that invites representatives from all federal parties, along with the top business, labor, and civil society leaders, as well as many other experts. As we like to say, we bring people and ideas together. And now a very special thank you to the donors and sponsors that make all our events possible, and in particular our sustaining sponsors that include Canada's Building Trades Unions, the International Association of Firefighters, and MFCAO, Ontario's professional employees. I would also like to extend a very special thank you to the gold sponsor for this conference, Bruce Power, as well as to Mr. Charles Coffey. Now, very briefly on the format, we will be having a discussion with our guests for about 40 minutes, leaving the balance of the time, so about 20 minutes or so, to answer Q's and A's from you, the audience. So please use the question box on your screen, and we will get to as many questions as we can before we wrap up, probably at noon Eastern time, or perhaps a little thereafter, given the late start. Today, we have a wonderful panel of Canadians who work in various fields and have addressed workplace and employee issues in different ways. We have with us today Dave Ballmer, who's the president and CEO of MFCAO, Ontario's professional employees, which represents about 15,000 professionals across Ontario. Mr. Ballmer is a frequent panelist at union, human resources, labor relations, academic, and think tank events, and regularly addresses progressive workplace relationships, the value of the public service, and the workplace of the future. Also with us today, who I gather will be along momentarily, is Cynthia Leach, who's an economist and senior director, economic thought leadership at RBC. She helps shape the narratives and research agendas around the RBC Economic Thought Leadership Team's forward-looking economic and policy analysis. And to get us started today, our moderator today will be none other than Mr. Brian Gallant, who's of course a co-chair of this conference, as well as the CEO for the Canadian Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation. Brian is of course a former Premier of New Brunswick as well. So on that note, I will turn it over to you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Merci à vous tous et toutes d'être parmi nous aujourd'hui. Nous sommes ravis de parler de ce sujet. We're very excited to talk about this subject with two fantastic guests. As was mentioned, Cynthia is working on connecting, but we have Dave here who is going to help us set the stage, hopefully, for this conversation. And as was mentioned really quickly, just to remind you, please do send in any questions you may have, and around 2/3 the way into the webinar, we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, as Francesca had mentioned. So Dave, please help us set the stage a little bit for this conversation. Let's talk a little bit about your perspective on how there has been disruption for workplaces in Canada, and maybe a little more specifically, what have been the challenges of working in large workplaces, or any workplaces for that matter, during the pandemic over the last almost 2 years now?
Yeah, good morning, Brian, and thanks to Pearson for the opportunity. I represent 15,000 professionals who are a part of this greater 65,000 who work for the province of Ontario. And so we are actually the second largest employer in Ontario. Only the federal's counterparts have more. So for us, literally up the street from Bay Street in downtown Toronto, we shared, I think, the exact same predicament, if you will, that the financial district did, that the corporate world did, in that literally and figuratively we had to get as many people out the door around March 13th or March 16th and working remotely as quick as possible. On the professional front, we were able to get about 98% of our members working remotely within a week or so from home. In our case, 21 months later, we've just started a hybrid return where people are working 1 or 2 days a week in the office and the remaining 3 or 4 at home or at a satellite location. I know most of downtown Toronto from a corporate perspective is starting to come back as well and will in the new year. And I guess the challenge is, Brian, especially for us in the public services, there can be no disruption, as you're well aware from your background as a premier. You know, it's 24/7, 365. So it was moving things off line and back online as quickly as possible and making sure that those services continue to be provided. In our situation, I think about 50% of Ontario's public service, about 30 or 35,000 remained in the physical workplace, as we refer to it now, in that they needed the machinery or the technology or the location itself to actually deliver the services they provide. And you can imagine correctional facilities and so on. You don't get to take a prisoner home with you for your remote work. You have to actually show up at the physical workspace. And so the challenges from a health and safety perspective were very different in that a good number of us had the greater safety of being at home and being sequestered in the early days when nobody knew what to expect, while the other half had to continue to go into the workplace. And I think not to get too political ever, because we try to be as nonpartisan as possible. I think all in all, Ontario's done a good job of that. I know there are public services elsewhere in Canada that never left and went to remote work. I know there are others that have been back and forth like yo-yos, if I can use that term. Some of our friends out west who have been in and out as the premiers of the day out there have decided that, you know, they're going to have their Saskatchewan summers and so on. And here in Ontario, there's been the steadiness, at least, of knowing whether you're in the workplace or not. And we've done a good job, I think, of maintaining services. We like to think we've brought some calm to the chaos. You know, kept what was left of the economy after the initial hit up and running. And you know, we're actually, I make my members well aware of this all the time, that we're actually quite privileged. And it's our disposable income that keeps a lot of the communities in Ontario and across Canada. If you're a public servant, often we're the backbone of the local economy. And so maintaining our employment, maintaining our services, and making sure that they happened regardless of where they were being delivered from, whether it was from your kitchen table or from your original office, it's been pretty seamless to date. Not that there haven't been challenges, there have been, but that's kind of the initial exodus, and getting ourselves up and running was probably the biggest challenge.
There's no question in my mind that we often collectively underestimate the important work and sacrifices of public servants. So obviously, through you, a big thank you to everybody that has worked so hard over the last pandemic to continue to deliver services, especially those on the front lines. So on that note, though, I would be curious as to hear your thoughts on this. Has there been anything sort of positive, a sort of a positive consequence of dealing with the pandemic and sort of the disruption to the workplace? And if so, is there a way to take those positives and make sure we kind of carry them into the future?
Yeah, no, there definitely have been positives. I think some of it is the new technology that we're using, you and I are using right at the moment. We joke about coming to a TV screen near you, repetitively all day long. It's either a Zoom or a Teams call or something to that effect. So we've become much more tech savvy as a group. We've had to come up with ways to meet with our greater membership. So whether it's me with my 15,000 members or RBC trying to reach out to its staff, province-wide, countrywide, etc., having to have town halls in TV broadcast stations so that you can get your message out. It's been, I think, a whirlwind on the technical side of things, and it'll be, I think, how to marry that with the traditional office and the face-to-face that is still absolutely required. There's more planful contact, which is good and bad. So you can appreciate that, you know, the open door policy is great until people walk in your door and take your time on you. My observation has been that in the cyber world we've been in, your time is much better scheduled and protected and used, because you literally have to plan to talk to Brian at 10:30. You can't just, you know, happen by Brian's office and have a conversation. So we meet with our staff, we meet with our stakeholders in a much more thoughtful manner than we did before. And when we go back to whatever the future norm is, it will be, you know, balancing that, because I think the reality will be that remote work, which is typically what we refer to it as, whether that's working from home or working for a satellite location at the edge of a suburban sprawl, you know, so you don't have to go all the way downtown into Ottawa or Toronto to get to your physical office, that's going to be the norm. And you know, the future of work and how we carry it out and where we carry it out from is very much in flux. Some of the, you know, from the employer side, because it can obviously be appreciative of their concerns, there's going to be less real estate expenses because they're going to be able to shrink their physical footprint. There's going to be less expenses on the utilities side. They're going to, you know, be able to get rid of a lot of the infrastructure that is required for a customary workplace going forward. And so that's good for the employer. In our case, that's good for the taxpayer. And I think that longer term positives, especially if I'm talking about in Toronto, less traffic on the 400 series highways, less traffic in the Toronto transit system. The climate appreciates that, I'm sure. The infrastructure appreciates that. If you allow people to work remotely, they can potentially work from a place where they can actually afford to buy a house in, you know, perhaps Oshawa or Guelph or Hamilton, as opposed to downtown Toronto. And so for younger people, that's going to be an advantage. And then perhaps one you can appreciate, coming from the Maritimes. I'm originally from Ottawa, and if I wanted to get ahead in the provincial world, I had to move to Toronto. And now you don't have to do that. There's no reason that you can't take a promotion in New Brunswick and be working at the heart of government in Ottawa. And so there will be long-term benefits for sure, Brian.
And Brian, Dave, I just wanted to mention I'm actually here and embarrassingly appropriate for this discussion. I'm in front of 4 different devices of 3 brands and still cannot connect my video. So my apologies.
All good. We're still going to get your ideas and thoughts. So that's what's important here, Cynthia. So thank you for that. Dave, very, very fascinating comments. Thank you. It's interesting because even now moving forward, when people will physically be in an office, the open door policy will have to be modified a bit, because people are going to come in and people will be on a Zoom call, right? Like it'll actually be sort of an everlasting modification to that sort of approach. So that'll be interesting to watch, and certainly your points about some of the benefits of being able to work remotely are very very interesting. And maybe one more question for you, Dave, and then Cynthia, I want to ask you about a report that has come out from RBC. So Dave, one question, because you mentioned this at the top here, that obviously there are some people in the public service that were more easily able to go and work remotely quicker and obviously in a more sustained way, versus others that have to be there physically. What's the level of satisfaction of working in this sort of new age, and what would be maybe the disparities of satisfaction and challenges for those 2 different groups, if you don't mind me putting it that way?
Yeah, for sure. I think overall, those who have remained in the front lines, they face a degree of risk that most of us don't face on a day-to-day basis. So Not that it's not a big deal to be a nurse or a police officer or whatever, but there's an inherent with that. So I think for them, they've appreciated that they're now in a streamlined workplace where there's not as many people, it's not as cluttered, it's not as busy, there's more space for them. And they, I think to some extent, I have previous history in that world myself, just come to grips with that's what their careers are about, and they're forever going to be dealing with whatever the latest crisis is. I think to some extent they would like to explore whatever flexibilities the workplace might be able to offer them. And do they always have to be into the office, or are there other arrangements that can be made? For those who are working remotely, it goes from one gamut to the other. As a union, we're surveying them all the time, trying to make sure we represent them appropriately. And there are some who want to work 5 days a week from home. There are some who don't even want to work one day. They're social people. They live in small spaces. They have no air conditioning. They rather go to the, like, there's really basic human things that come into it. And so the challenge will be to find a workplace of the future that meets the needs of both the management and the employee side. And the management side has been doing literally what we're doing. They're all working from home as well. And so how do you manage when you can't necessarily walk the floor, when you can't necessarily see people? You have to do it with much greater trust. There'll be, I think there'll be a real need to improve the skill sets of our workplace leaders so that they can manage in what will be a much more virtual cyber world going forward. And they have the social skills and the soft skills that are required to do that. And I think from an employee side of things, I think the best thing that we can do, especially with large employers, is do some sort of an evaluative process that recognizes what flexibility a job can have, so that when your niece that you mentioned from out west applies for a job, she knows what she's getting into. And that job is either going to be allowing 2 days from home, perhaps 1 day from a satellite location partway into the downtown, and 2 days from somewhere else. And I think that would be helpful at regenerating and making sure that we get the next generation interested, because otherwise the public service can be a tough sell, because we don't actively recruit. And so there needs to be a pull or an appeal there. And I think we have the ability to strike that balance and to lure people in with them thinking that they're coming to a very modernized workplace.
Interesting, and we'll certainly want to talk a little bit later on to both you and Cynthia about the idea of youth participation. So Cynthia, RBC just released a report, very exciting. I had the chance to read it, and I would certainly invite and encourage anybody listening to take the chance to go through it. So it's entitled The Great Canadian Restart, How 2022 Can Spark an Era of Greener, More Robust Growth. So Cynthia, if you don't mind, what would be the highlights of this report?
Absolutely. First of all, just a piece of context for why we wrote this report now. And it's, we're getting close to recovering from the pandemic. And so as we'd expect, as we get to the end of cyclical growth, we're going to slowly converge to our long-term economic growth, basically the speed limit for the economy. And the factors that influence that are, labor force growth and productivity. And where those are at imply a relatively, slow or muted pace of long-term growth. This has, long-term growth has been falling for decades. It's not just Canada, it's other advanced economies. But the question we're proposing is, does it have to be that way? Given that there are opportunities seeded during the pandemic with a more digital, knowledge-based, services-based economy, greener economy that could be avenues through which we can increase our business investment and our talent, and to achieve a higher growth rate. And so within those trends, there are challenges and opportunities. And in terms of our conversation today, a big piece of the puzzle is human capital and talent. We know the big driver there, the slow labor force growth, it's the aging population. We're seeing it reflected today in the economy. Everyone's talking about labor shortages. We have a 6% high job vacancy rate. In some provinces, it's particularly acute or more acute. And that's reflection of the fact that there's been about 1 million people leaving the labor force over the last, since around 2008, when we had our peak participation rate. And it's going to get more intense, these labor shortages, because over the next 15 years, we could see another 1.5 million people leave the labor force. And even when immigration gets back on track, it's, we're still going to see a changing and aging of the population. So we've got to think about new avenues to recruit talent and also develop talent, because it's not just a numbers game. It's about equipping the workforce with the skills of the future.
Fascinating. So maybe you covered this a bit already, but just to sort of delve a little bit deeper into this. So how has the pandemic sort of impacted the labor challenges, maybe labor opportunities for the country? And you spoke about this already, but maybe just to sort of dive a little bit deeper. How were these trends looking pre-pandemic? What has happened during the pandemic that might be worrying you, or that you might see as an opportunity when it comes to labor force and talent? And then what would be sort of maybe the key things that we would have to do to sort of mitigate the challenges, seize the opportunity? So if you can take us a little bit through what was happening pre-pandemic, what you think just happened, and what's going to be important moving forward.
Absolutely. Population aging isn't new, and it was definitely foreseeable. So it's no surprise that we're on this kind of path, but it doesn't make it any less more difficult. And the pandemic has exacerbated it in some ways. We know that we saw a reduction in the number of retirements over the last couple of years. So to the extent there's that catch up in retirements, or increased asset values encouraging earlier than anticipated retirements, it could be particularly acute year for labor shortages. Also, because our immigration system, is not yet back on track. We're still seeing slow recovery there, but we're not yet at our pre-pandemic levels of welcoming permanent residents. And so that's one thing. But the other thing is, in terms of where there's also a lot of untapped potential. We know that before the pandemic, there were participation rate gaps for women, that if you close them today would be another 1.2 million people in the labor force. We also know that there are earnings and wage gaps and employment gaps for some visible minority groups, for immigrants. And this represents a huge source of untapped human capital that the Canadian economy could really leverage to drive growth going forward. That was the case before. We know that many of those groups experienced, extra burdens during the pandemic because, they were either in industries affected directly by lockdowns, or in the case, especially early in the pandemic, of certain parents and women in particular who had challenges with childcare. So we've seen some of those, more of a recovery, but in terms of the question that we're setting up here over the long-term prospects for Canada and what Canada needs to do over the long term, it's really to bring these sources of talent into the labor market and to be skilled so that and credentials recognized and skilled such that they can be participating in these new growth pathways down the road. And the last thing maybe I'll mention is, it's not just about attracting talent, it's about developing talent. And we can traditionally think about this as the education system equipping youth with the skills of the future, which will be particular digital green skills, but to Dave's point, will also be a lot of those soft or human skills, collaboration, problem solving, critical thinking, those inherently human skills that machines can't do. And that's something we consistently find in our research. But I think the important takeaway too is we're going to have to start paying a lot more attention to mid-career workers. We know that Canada has a gap that's particularly high in the OECD between, high wage and low wage workers in terms of who has access to on-the-job training. We also see a divergence in small and big businesses, and for older 55 plus workers and younger workers. And so that's something that should concern us as we see the rate of change of work, the nature of work changing at an increasing pace. We have to ensure that our workforce has the skills to keep up and keep fueling the economy.
Well, thank you for that, Cynthia. I'm going to plug something that I used to always say because I think it's very relevant today as well. So 5-6 years ago, when I was the premier of the province of New Brunswick, I used to always talk about how we had global challenges of climate change. We had, I would say global, but also in the Western world, inequalities that are rampant and need to be addressed. And then I would say specifically to New Brunswick, the challenge that I would apply to us at the time was an aging population. So to your point, it's not a trend that just started with the pandemic. And then on top of that, the report speaks of sort of people putting on pause their retirement, which I thought was interesting and obviously something that's important to highlight, meaning that after the pandemic, we may, with an aging population, already have had a lot of retirements, but then on top of that, we may see a whole other wave because of people that have sort of maybe delayed because of the pandemic for different reasons. So on that, I'd be curious. I mean, you've covered again a lot of it, but I'd like to unpack some of that. So immigration is something that the report speaks a lot about. Quebec announced yesterday, to your point, some investments and efforts to recognize credentials a bit better from immigrants to be able to work in the province. So what needs to happen? Let's start with immigration. I want to unpack a lot of the things that you mentioned. Let's start with immigration. What needs to happen there for that to be a part of the solution for a more robust economy and one in which we have a strong labor force moving forward? Are you still there, Cynthia?
Sorry, can you hear me?
We hear you now.
Okay, sorry, pressed the wrong button, classic. Okay. I think immigration is a great place to start. And I should add, in terms of context, something that I didn't mention, which is that the competition for skilled immigrants is probably going to get, higher particularly with work from home or remote work, whatever you want to call it, and other countries facing some of the same pressures. So Canada really needs to, does very well in immigration by several metrics, and it's a system we should be proud of, but there are areas we can do better. And so the government announced the 1% target, i.e. 1% of the population every year in immigration levels. And that was, it's not clear whether that's permanent or not. We think that should be made permanent. We think that there needs to be, a more forward-looking assessment in some of these special visa programs for these type of emerging or evolving skills, green skills, more than digital skills. And it's not just these what you might call conventionally high-tech skills. It's also skilled trades who are going to build a lot of this infrastructure going forward. It's healthcare to deal with an aging population. So Canada already has an immigration system where we do have some labor market responsiveness, but we need to be a little bit more forward-looking. And, also I think one thing I keep hearing is some pre-arrival labor market support might actually help immigrants integrate better into the labor market or more quickly, which will have an impact. And I think finally is, the credential recognition point is a long-standing one, and it's difficult. And I think supports targeting employers, not necessarily the big ones like RBC who have a lot of resources to do this, but there are a lot of smaller ones that have a harder time recognizing or, taking the time to recognize foreign experience and credentials. And so I think some kind of collaborative approaches are needed there to do something different.
Very solid, concrete recommendations, if I do say so myself. Dave, on the question of aging population, two things I'd be very curious to get your insights on. So first, what does that mean for public service and the services that people depend on? What does it mean for our ability, whether it be Ontario, whether it be New Brunswick or the country as a whole, to be able to deliver the services we need with an aging population? And then second, more specifically to the group you represent, what does that mean in terms of the potential of retirements? And is that a concern? Is that something that the public service should be thinking more about in terms of ensuring that the labor pool and the workforce that we're going to need moving forward for all these services to be delivered is going to be there? For your thoughts.
Right. No, absolutely. And maybe I'll come at it from this perspective you're suggesting, but also from the perspective that my members write policy and what policies might actually be beneficial. And so in Ontario, 65,000 employees. We have I joke we were lean before lean was cool. If capita in public service as British Columbia, which is the second leanest, we would have 80,000 employees. So we're already at 65,000. And we've achieved that, Brian, in large part with minimal harm to employees by early retirement packages. So a good portion of the baby boomer, folks that are north of 60, 55 have all been bought out. And so that's probably not the same fear that it might be in other places for that reason. Those retirements are just not there. One thing we have a problem with is, and Cynthia touched on this, is people leave us mid-career. So we are the Ottawa Senators, and we bring people up through the farm system, and then they leave to greater goodness and go somewhere else where they could quite frankly make more money or do something more exciting. And so that's one of our problems, I would suggest, in the public service. And then the policy stuff. So the credentialism that we just talked about, kudos to any of the governments in Ontario, any of the jurisdictions that are looking at that, because that's just long overdue. A doctor should not be driving a back taxi in Toronto when we could be making use of him or her during events like we're going through right now. So having the wisdom to find ways to fast track that but still keep people safe is an absolute. And then I think just merely making some stronger decisions than we have in the past when it comes to human services. So for example, in Ontario and Quebec, where I know the most about what happened in the long-term care system, nobody in the long-term care system should have to work in 3 different nursing homes, having 3 different jobs to provide for themselves. Once upon a time, being a healthcare professional, a nurse, or any derivative thereof, was a good job. And why is it now that predominantly women in those roles actually have to hold down 3 positions? And it's because a lot of that's gone for profit, and it's not. It's now become something that we're harming ourselves with. So to your point about where's future work? Well, in the health sector, right? There's going to be a tremendous need for people in the health sector. And if we want to help ourselves economically, we would actually make those back into good jobs, good paying jobs, not exorbitantly overpaid jobs, actually have full-time employment. We're in the healthcare sector now. Full-time employment is almost a unicorn. It really is, unless you're a doctor who's essentially a contractor to a hospital. Everybody else is on some form of precarious work, and those are professionals. So I think from a policy perspective, we also have to change our thoughts if we're going to, and one final thought as well that my members work on is the affordability of housing. People can't buy a house, people don't get married, people don't have children, the population stagnates, we have shortages. And in Toronto right now, anecdotally, the number of people who are not doing their traditional, house, family, children type thing is off the charts, because nobody can even fathom taking care of more than just themselves and their partner.
Cynthia, I'm going to go over to you with sort of 2 questions, but obviously very related, and they're based on Dave's comments. So the report issued by RBC very much speaks to the affordability of housing, and specifically in 3 urban centers. So maybe if you want to speak to that, and also as Dave mentioned, the sort of care economy, the care sectors, the report that was issued by RBC also goes at great lengths to talk about how there's a need to increase women's participation in the workforce by looking at policies such as childcare and other things that would be able to help. So maybe on those 2 aspects, which are obviously very crucial to ensuring a strong labor force here in the country, if you could speak to those.
For sure. I mean, we talk about housing in a few areas in our report, but the 3 cities that the report talks about, Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, about 60% of immigrants end up in those 3 cities. even though those 3 cities only represent about 35% of the population. And 2 out of 3 of those cities, i.e. Toronto and Vancouver, have some of the highest housing prices in the world measured against median income. So that's just thinking about it, the margin attracting skilled talent. How do you attract and retain them when these are the type of, living costs or housing situations that are being faced? And of course, it's not just about, attracting, it's also about keeping talent that we have here. So housing really needs to be an area of attention. And, it's a tough one because it's jurisdictionally split. And so we need to see a lot more, collaboration between provinces and the government to look at all the levers, not just, 1 or 2 in isolation. Pushing on the demand side is not going to help if we don't have good supply side solutions. So we need to see some more cooperation there. And then on the care that Dave brought up and the services, I think that's something that we've highlighted that I didn't really speak to yet, about the real opportunity for services growth. We're already a services-based economy, but in Canada and globally, services are primed for growth, and that's related to the increased digitization presents a lot more opportunity for data and digital services and Internet of Things, all those cross-border services as well. But also a graying population tends to consume more services than goods, and so that includes health services, other care related services, or the gamut. And so that's where there's a ton of opportunity. In terms of women's labor force participation, of course, a lot of women are in the care sector. Childcare continues to be an important lever. There is the National Childcare Program now that most provinces, by my recollection, have signed onto, and so that's a step in the right direction. I think a lot's going to depend on the structure of those programs. So $10 a day average is consistent with many different distributions. The question for me is, are those programs targeting the biggest affordability gaps, the biggest accessibility gaps, because not everyone works standard 8 to 4 shift? And of course, and I think there has been emphasis on this, if we're going to see the capacity development on the supply side, so having the teachers and the talent we need there to support this enhanced or larger childcare model. So all those things, I guess, part of maybe one of the overall comments on the report is, it's not easy to turn around the growth trajectory. It's been there for a long time. These are not easy issues to solve, and it's going to mean getting a lot of little things right. But it's absolutely important that we continue to push in these areas.
Fascinating comments on the immigration component that you said. Really interesting statistics, and obviously being from New Brunswick, I would say that an option is I wouldn't be doing my province the service that I should if I didn't say, well, they can come here. So we certainly need new Canadians to come help us as well grow and be all that much better. But I want to also plug in for those that would be listening, maybe from more rural areas or parts that are outside the major urban centers of the country. What seems to be difficult here is there's not as many supports for a new Canadian, but I know lots of communities are trying to figure that out, and that's certainly a challenge for those that are outside the large urban centers. One thing that I want to touch upon with you, Cynthia, is, and I'm fascinated by this because there's been so much discussion, and rightfully so, over the last little while about inequalities and inequities and helping racialized Canadians, advancing Indigenous reconciliation, ensuring that we're eliminating gender inequality. So all of those things have been discussed a lot recently, and again, rightfully so. And often with the sort of the frame of it being a moral imperative, which again, rightfully so, to be discussed that way. But what I find really interesting in this report, it talks also about the economic benefits of ensuring that we have larger participations and economic success for these groups, and sort of address the systemic barriers that may be in front of them, and obviously putting in policies, efforts, investments that will help ensure that they have the economic success that they certainly deserve. So maybe speak to that, because I'm fascinated by that, and I think it's an important contribution to the discussion. Again, moral imperative is more than enough for it to happen, but obviously having this economic consideration is helpful as well. So if you could speak to that.
For sure. I think you're right. These are pretty stark numbers that we have in the report. So I mentioned before that closing the women and men's labor force participation gap could add 1.2 million women to the labor force. And think about that again in the context of the numbers I spoke before, where since 2008 we've seen about 1 million people leave because of population aging. So these are material and consequential numbers. And then two of my economist colleagues here at RBC Economics estimated what the potential lift could be to GDP of closing visible minority earnings gaps. And a couple of years ago, historical employment and earnings gaps for immigrants. And on the visible minority side, it could add a lift to GDP of about $30 billion a year. And closing the immigration gap could add about $50 billion a year to GDP a year. Now, those two things are not additive because, of course, you have overlapping populations, but they're meant to be illustrative to show exactly what you're saying, Brian, that there's this economic imperative. And, it's going to, if it's hard enough to get talent, integrate new talent into the Canadian labor market, well, think about the resources that we have here and what needs to be done to take better advantage of, the great human capital and potential talent we have here. It's kind of a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm. Well, and let's talk about another group. And Dave, I'll go to you on this one. Youth and attracting, recruiting, retaining youth into the public service, into the sectors in which we need a strong labor force here in the country. What are the challenges that may have been created with the pandemic? What are the opportunities, and what do we need to do moving forward to ensure the largest and most robust participation of youth that we could hope for?
I think we have to take stock of what it is that they, as a generation, actually want. Forever, those of us who are 40, 50, 60, we think we know what others want. We don't necessarily know exactly what they want or they need. And I think a lot of what has transpired during the pandemic aligns with what a lot of the young professionals that I run into are interested in, where they want the ability to have a flexible, they want to add quality of life. I think a lot of them have seen their parents either work too hard or too long, or and they want to have all the economics that come with being a professional, but they also want to have the quality of life, and they want lifelong learning. When I talk to them, they can't get enough education is one thing that and I think Cynthia mentioned that we need to hire the talent-based people and then educate them to do the job that they need to do for us that moment, because that job's going to change every year or two. So just bring in the best talent and then and be willing to train them and be willing to spend money on them and invest in them, and provide them with, I think, really fundamental things that came out of the pandemic. Like, how is it that we don't have sick time for everybody? You get 2 weeks of vacation to rest, but you get no time to be sick with pay. That's not lost on a younger generation. So when they shop their skill sets around, they're going to try to find the best deal they can. And in a world where there could be, or there are labor shortages, employers are going to have to be more competitive with the broader compensation package as opposed to just the salary. And what is it that you're bringing that person into, and what are they becoming a part of? And I think there's all kinds of, sometimes, change has to be forced upon us, and nature has decided in the last couple of years to enforce some change on us. So maybe we need to, take the opportunity to assess what it is that people want. And from a public service perspective, I'll just maybe finish with, we actually need to do what corporations do, and we need to actually recruit talent. We don't. People happen onto the lawn at Parliament Hill or the Queen's Park Legislature looking for employment. It's not that we go out and try to find the brightest bulbs who can work on environment policy for us, and we should be doing that. And why aren't we? You know, how much effort would that take? So I challenge routinely the senior bureaucrats where I am in Ontario to do that. And we now actually have a chief talent management officer at the deputy minister level in Ontario. And that's a good thing, because we should be competing in the public sector with the private sector or the for-profit sector for those talented people.
From my perspective, that's a really good point. And I want to add that, and it's, you know, alert of a shameless plug coming here, but the Canadian Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation, which I lead, we had done some research in May about where people were with their life priorities. And what was really fascinating is that I think it was about 75% of 3/4 of Canadians that said their life priorities had changed in some way during the pandemic, which is probably normal. And again, which is probably normal, people said my health, both physical and mental, and my family are a lot more important to me now than they were before the pandemic. Young people, mental health was one that was very stark in terms of an increase of importance during the pandemic. And what was also fascinating, 42% of the respondents said that they would think about changing their job over the next year. And when asked why, those 42% said it wasn't because of compensation. Only 6% mentioned it was because of compensation. And I just find that fascinating, because I think a lot of people, when you say if you're not happy in your job, oh, you don't get the benefits, you don't get, you know, your salary's not enough. That's where our mind goes to. And really it was about people felt that the employer was putting profits over people. Work-life balance was certainly an issue, and diversity, inclusion in the workplace, essentially the values of the employee wasn't represented enough, were the three main buckets as to why people are thinking of leaving their job. Anyways, all that to say, I agree with you, Dave. We can't assume that we know, so that survey was helpful of sort of getting a sense of where people were at. Cynthia, youth participation is something the report that RBC has issued certainly covers a lot of. Lifelong learning is something as well that is part of the recommendations. Post-secondary education. So please speak a little bit, if you will, to how the report touches on these important points that Dave just made.
Yeah, I think Dave made great points about, you know, competition is along many dimensions. And as a former public servant in another life too, like the public service has, you know, a meaningful work in a lot of ways that presents a big attraction when you think about the overall, what an employer is offering overall to potential workers. So, and on that, like one other thing that, you know, people should be concerned about, and I think employers will be, is, you know, Dave spoke about having benefits, but also access to training. So going back to my point before that, you know, for example, smaller businesses are less likely to offer training, and we need, you know, access to training to increase. Labor shortages are a good impetus for that. But it certainly is probably something that youth and other workers are going to be looking at when they think about the jobs before them and keeping their skills fresh. But lifelong learning, of course, starts sooner than that. And so there are opportunities, you know, for standards within the new early learning system for curriculums to be updated more with, you know, more digital skills. It's my understanding that not all provinces have, you know, coding in their curriculums yet, or, you know, they're working toward it, but given where we're at, that's something we need to accelerate. We've also talked about in some of our recent report on the skilled trades, for example, giving more exposure in curriculums to skilled trades, given it's an area where, you know, we've had labor shortages. We're going to continue to have a squeeze, and yet it's a sector that's very important for building, you know, the infrastructure of the new economy going forward. So we think that's really important. And one last thing I'll say, going back to the small business sector, is understandably, you know, small businesses have had, you know, they're more restrained in resources and in terms potentially of expertise, number of people. And certainly the pandemic has burdened some more of them with debt, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to be thinking longer term about, you know, how to invest in digital or how to train, how to plan for the skills that you need in the future. And I think we need to find new community models or collaborative models where, you know, small businesses can come together with, educational organizations, etc., to find a way to formalize and plan for these, future skills, because that agility in the economy and the labor force is going to be really important for transitioning to this new economy for Canada.
Fascinating. We have, we're on time that was scheduled, but we're going to take a few extra questions just because we did start a little bit later. So I want to ask, hi Andrew, good to see you. Just want to ask both Dave and Cynthia a question from the audience, which I think is really good. Those living with a disability is also a pool in which we find sort of underemployment, as it's often called. So often this is because of problems of access and support. So what can be done on that end from both maybe the private sector point of view, from the public service point of view? Is that something that we should be collectively discussing on how we address and ensure a strong, robust workforce moving forward in the country? So Dave, I'll start with you and then over to Cynthia.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, and thanks for the question. I think anecdotally, I have to believe that is an underutilized segment of our society for any number of reasons, whether it's just barriers and systemic issues that are impeding persons with disabilities. And just last week we had, I think, the International Day for Persons with Disabilities, and in the public service and through our particular work, we have built in articles in our collective agreement that are favorable to hiring persons with disabilities, or make it very difficult to let somebody go that's in one of those circumstances, because in the past we've seen that is sometimes it's easier to do that because often those folks will need more accoutrements in the office, if you will. They'll need other pieces of equipment and sort of secondary supports and so on. And so sometimes an employer can take an economic look at it and say that's maybe the person that. But I have to believe, though, that really doing some forms of, and we've done one recently in Ontario, a third-party review that was largely aimed at anti-Black racism, but not without its oversight or thought given to folks with disabilities. For example, what systemic barriers are there that we could remove, and how do we encourage people like that to come into the workplace? And technology has grown immensely in the last 2 years. So the incorporation of somebody with challenges into the work world, they're lesser and lesser every day. And so just having the broad-mindedness to think that way and to make sure that we're taking away really obvious impediments has to be a positive that can come from that. But yeah, I think those are my thoughts on that, Brian.
Well, thank you, Dave. Cynthia, maybe I see Andrew sort of saying that we got to get on to the other one, but Cynthia, maybe 30 seconds of your thoughts on this.
Well, we can't leave any sources of talent untapped, and people with disabilities aren't just a source of untapped talent. It's that they could bring unique perspectives given what they've had to adapt to. And we know that it's not just about having the people, it's having the skills, and creativity and problem solving are part of those skills. And diversity brings that range of problem solving skills into the workforce. So I think given where we're at, employers, the private sector should no doubt be looking at disabled people as a rich source of talent.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Dave. If I may, to those listening, to Dave's point, please consider working for the public service if you have the chance, and he's going to start actively recruiting you. And to Cynthia's report, the report that was released by RBC, I again strongly encourage you to take a look at it. It's very well thought out and makes a lot of important and I think relevant points. So thank you, Dave. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you to everybody listening. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Brian Gallant. Thank you for moderating the session today, as you do so wonderfully, these sessions with fairly complex issues, and you're able to sort of pick them apart and make them all quite understandable for us. We appreciate you're doing this for us regularly and for being the co-chair of the conference this week. Dave Bulmer, thank you for sharing your experience with us from your leadership of the Ontario Public Service in this time of change. So it's really important to hear from you, and you really shared a lot of interesting issues that we don't get to hear enough about. So thank you for that. Cynthia Leach, the work you folks put out in thought leadership at RBC is quite remarkable, and we're pleased to be able to join us today. So thank you, all three of you, and I will now invite our next panel. We have a discussion with the High Commissioner of South Africa, which will start in a moment. So thanks to the outgoing panel, and welcome to our next panel. Indira Naidu Harris, I can see you now, and I'm sure we'll have, I understand the High Commissioner is logged in, so we have you both on. Hello, High Commissioner. And I think we can hear you. Can we hear you both? Indira, can we hear you?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. It's great to be here. I just want to make sure that the High Commissioner is with us.
Okay.
Yes, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can. So,
yeah, indeed. So I just have a few words to say, and then I'll pass it over to you. So I just want to say it's a real pleasure to welcome our next guest to talk about Canada-Africa, Canada-South Africa relations, and the sudden appearance of the Omicron variant. Her Excellency Sibongiseni Dlamini Manatambo is the High Commissioner of South Africa to Canada, and I want to start by thanking her for her friendship with us at the Pearson Centre, and more importantly for her work in strengthening the relations between South Africa and Canada. The ties between our countries are deep and strong, and South Africa would always have a special place in the hearts of Canadians, and I think it's a mutual love affair. I say this to you, High Commissioner, because I know that your posting will come to, which began in 2017, will come to a scheduled end in a few weeks. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for your friendship. Before becoming High Commissioner, I should tell our audience that she occupied senior executive roles in the mining industry, in various government departments, and lastly, with the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa. High Commissioner, I feel you have come to know Canada so well that often when I hear you speak, I forget that you're a South African. I think you're one of us as you come to know us so well, but I think when you do leave, you will always have a bit of Canadian in you wherever you go. Our moderator this afternoon, we're delighted to say, is Indira Naidu Harris, who's an advisory board member of the Pearson Centre and is Associate Vice President for Diversity and Human Rights at the University of Guelph. She's a former MPP and Senior Minister in the Government of Ontario, and before that was a national broadcaster in Canada and the US. So with that, over to you, Indira Naidu Harris.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for that lovely introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Pearson Centre Annual Conference, Agenda 2022, Priorities for the New Parliament and Government. Today, we're going to take a close look at Canada and Africa, Canada and South Africa, and how the challenges with COVID have been affecting our relationships. Let's start, though, by taking a quick look back. As you all may know, Canada established formal diplomatic relations with South Africa in 1939. And ever since then, as Andrew so eloquently put, Canada and South Africa have enjoyed deep, lasting ties based on shared values, security, and prosperity. In fact, Canada's anti-apartheid efforts in the 1980s, along with our support for the establishment of a multi-ethnic, multiracial democratic society in South Africa, strengthened the ties between our countries, with Canada bestowing Nelson Mandela with honorary citizenship in 2001. Today, Canada and South Africa work together on important issues such as women's empowerment, the environment, and climate, to name just a few. Our relations also involve various collaborations, including scholarships, training opportunities, internships, and local initiatives. In fact, two-way trade between our countries totaled a whopping $2.2 billion last year alone. But then enter COVID, navigating between the harsh realities of a global pandemic, addressing serious health issues, and dealing with troubling inequities in our society has been difficult for all of us and placed challenges on our relationships. And while the COVID-19 pandemic has challenged each and every one of us, it shone a bright light on those growing inequities in our communities and our world, especially when it comes to vaccine inequity. Today, we're going to take a close look at the relationship between Canada and Africa, Canada and South Africa, and how Omicron and COVID-19 issues are impacting these ties. So joining me now for this important conversation is Sibongiseni Dlamini Mntambo, the High Commissioner of South Africa to Canada. Welcome, High Commissioner, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
Hi, Commissioner. I'd like to start by getting a sense of the big picture. So if you don't mind, give me an idea of what Canada and Africa relationships are like in general these days. I mean, I know there are community projects and regional collaborations. How important is this relationship between Canada and Africa?
Thank you so much for that question. Let me just, on the onset, indicate that the collaborations between Canada and Africa, they are very, very important. I remember sometime this year, I took part in a roundtable discussion, which was organized by Canada Growth Coalition, whereby also the discussions were centered around the relations between Canada and South Africa and Africa, although they did also delve into South Africa. You know, the roundtable was meant to look into how Canada can improve its relations with Africa, because we believe both Africa and Canada, we believe that the relations can be improved. There is a lot of things that needs to be done. Now, in responding to your question, I would like to, again, first, just give a little bit of background on Africa before COVID-19 hit. The same background which I gave at that roundtable. Now, before COVID-19 hit, Africa was a continent increasingly seen as the next frontier of global progress and prosperity. Amongst others, this is buttressed by the fact that, firstly, despite centuries of plunder, Africa continues to be endowed with enormous and diverse natural resources like platinum, cobalt, gold, manganese, oil and gas, just to name a few. Secondly, Africa's growing population is essentially youthful and dynamic. It's educated and it's enterprising. This offers an attractive market for foreign goods. However, Africans are themselves increasingly seizing opportunities to tap and transform the continent's natural and human resources into marketable goods and services. Thirdly, policies decisively that have been taken over the last few decades by governments across the continent have led to remarkable improvements in African institutions of political governance and economic management. There also have been significant investment when it comes to building of modern infrastructure of the ports, airports. In South Africa, for instance, I'm always happy to tell Canadians or whoever wants to listen that South Africa has one of the best airports. Whether you are talking the OR Tambo or you are talking the Cape Town International Airport or King Shaka, our infrastructure is very good. The most recent infrastructural development in Africa, for instance, is the Kusungula Bridge connecting Botswana and Zambia. However, regardless of all these things that are in place, Canada is still lagging behind in this growing momentum to build strong and strategic partnerships with Africa. Canada's presence on the continent is largely limited to the narrow niche mining sector. This approach is markedly different from current trends, and it does not allow for the full bloom of Canada-Africa relations. There is need for clarity, for instance, in Canada-Africa relations, for a more coherent Canada-African trade investment policy and for the establishment of a bilateral platform for Canada-Africa cooperation. One of your professors, that is Professor David Hornsby, who is now at the Carleton University, who used to be at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, writing on the subject of Africa-Canada relations, that was in 2013, he said, let me quote, "Canada needs a more consistent and coherent strategy for engaging with Africa." Now, we are talking, and this is 2021. This call is valid today as it was then, years ago.
So you're making some amazing points, Commissioner, that basically Canada needs to broaden its view about the opportunities and the collaborations that could exist and should exist between Canada and Africa. But you're also saying that that piece translates into our relationships with South Africa. And so I want to talk to you about that a little bit. You're the High Commissioner for South Africa to Canada. And so tell me, what's been your experience over the last few years about Canada-South Africa relations?
Let me be honest with you, it has been good. The relations has been good. I would like to think that the 2 weeks, the 1 week and a few days, which have unfortunately shaken South Africa, with the South Africa detecting the Omicron, I hope it won't dent the relations. When you introduce the relations between Canada and Africa, yes, we have a long history with Canada. From the days when Canada led the international community when we were fighting for our freedom in the struggle for justice, Canada was brave enough to lead the international community. And given that, my understanding is that we have walked a very long distance with Canada. Canada understands where we come from. Canada understands how entrenched, for instance, the system of apartheid was. And we have been working very, very well together with Canada.
So let me focus this conversation a little bit more, High Commissioner. You touched on Omicron and COVID. Tell me about COVID-19. How has it hit Africa and South Africa, and what are the challenges that folks are facing on the ground?
COVID-19, firstly, I need us to understand that it has hit everyone very hard, but more so the developing countries, or the not so rich countries. Now, we have come up with a lot of terms, for instance, with vaccine equity. You would know that Africa right now, as we speak, it's only about 6 to 7% of people who have vaccinated. In South Africa, it's about 24% of people who have vaccinated. That is fully vaccinated. And those who have, including those who have only received 1 dose, we are talking 28%. But why is that? It's not that people do not want to vaccinate, but it is because there are no vaccines in Africa. We have had countries in the West, in Europe, hoarding vaccines. And as we speak, there is nothing wrong with that. Countries are already beginning to talk of booster vaccines, vaccinating children. But Africa is yet to speak about having vaccinated, given 1 dose to the majority of its people.
So you're really, High Commissioner, talking about vaccine inequity. In fact, infectious disease experts are saying travel bans, if, for example, that Canada recently put in with the Omicron virus against South Africa, it's been lifted briefly now, but experts are saying travel bans aren't the answer, that the answer is really that we should be making sure that countries around the world are getting enough vaccines for their people. So what do you think? Is this a big part of the challenges that folks in Africa and South Africa are facing right now? What should we be doing?
Perhaps to answer your question, let me start with travel bans. We have heard from the World Health Organization that there is no scientific basis for the travel bans. What countries did that closed the borders, it was a knee-jerk reaction. That has been repeated over and over again. And South Africa has also advised that, yes, the variant is infectious, it's easily transmittable, but there haven't been any hospitalizations because of the variant. That is to answer the first one. But what do we want to see? Yes, it would be good for countries to lift this travel ban, because it's not, this goes beyond families. It goes beyond businesses. There were families who wanted to visit their loved ones in the different countries, but they cannot. They will spend Christmas or the festive season by themselves because Canada has decided to close its borders. What has unfolded, unfortunately, in the world affects the whole the community, the whole community. Canada is, I will talk about Canada and not the other countries because I'm in Canada. It's actually punishing honesty. It's punishing honesty and it's incentivizing dishonesty. It's promoting people to, or countries to hide the truth. And that is most unfortunate. It's a most unfortunate stance, as some countries will then decide to hide the information. And this is really taking us backwards, because how do we fight the pandemic when the information is hidden?
How has that travel ban affected relations then between Canada and South Africa? I know it's been lifted briefly as people return, Canadians return, but how did you as High Commissioner view that decision, and how has it affected your relations with Canadians?
It's a very unfortunate decision by Canada. It's very, very, very unfortunate. More so because our scientists have advised to say, do not close the borders. But unfortunately, Canada still has its borders closed. I'm not talking about what you say has been partly lifted, because it's for the Canadians who are in South Africa to come back. But they also, unfortunately, when Canada was doing this, I don't think they thought it through, because they went to an extent of inconveniencing their citizens by, for instance, not accepting the tests from South Africa. I mean, if South Africa can detect this variant, how do you not trust the test that we conduct in South Africa? So for us, that is very puzzling. So now Canadians have to stop in a third country for another test. And it is even worse when you think, when this whole thing started, it was the Ethiopian Airlines that were still operational. And in the Canada's advisory, they say they discourage Canadians to go to Ethiopia because of the unrest there. So where did it leave the Canadians? So I don't think whoever decided on this thought this through. But look, I have no right to say this is what Canada must do or this is what Canada must do. But Canada must follow science. We have to follow science. So Canada must also follow science.
And of course, Canadians will say we have to work hard to protect our citizens and Canadians, from this terrible pandemic. But I understand very well some of the points that you were raising and the need for us to have this conversation. Part of that conversation has to do with vaccine inequity. Do you want to touch on that before we go back to the Canada-South Africa relations? This is a growing conversation around the world about the need to really battle this pandemic by making sure that vaccines are readily available to all countries and people around the world.
Perhaps let me first go to your point that Canada needs to maybe first protect its citizens, because there is something amiss there. If Canada really wanted to protect its citizens first, I've heard that they wanted to buy time. Then you buy time and close the borders for all the countries where this Omicron has been detected. But this time around, Canada only closed borders to South Africa and the neighboring countries.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to say this, but it makes me wonder, are we not seeing this variant? Are we not painting this variant a certain color? That for me is very disturbing, because it's only Africa and the neighboring countries. And I have mentioned this, the countries, the neighboring countries, which also have been banned. Unfortunately for them, they have been banned, but they have not detected the variant. It's only detected by South Africa. And again, the unfortunate thing is that when we detected it, the reporting was that now they are looking at the variant as originated in South Africa. So the next part of your question was then with regards to
vaccines being readily available to various countries.
Yes. There is a clear power and access disparity that the world can no longer ignore. It's obvious, more vaccine and more protected individuals will equate to a fewer infections. Yes.
Oh, I apologize. But so I'd like to talk, finally about that and about your relationship with Canada and possibly the role that Canada can play as a voice for equity when it comes to vaccines, but also how Canada can work to build the relationship that you've worked so hard to build with your work between Canada and South Africa. So advice, when it comes to vaccines and equity and the role Canada can play there, and also how you feel that will develop the relationship between Canada and South Africa more generally.
Look, Canada has contributed. I must give credit to Canada on also their contribution towards the ending the pandemic. For instance, in terms of COVAX, I think it was if I'm not mistaken, I think it was in May this year, where the Prime Minister announced the ACT, the contribution of, I think it was 378 million, some way along those lines. That is really admirable. But there is one thing that we also need, where we think Canada should support us. That is the TRIPS waiver. That is very important. In another interview that I had, I remember the new Minister of Health indicated that Canada is supporting the TRIPS waiver. I would like to correct that. Canada has not yet shown support for the TRIPS waiver. In about 2 weeks, I think 2 weeks ago, the SADC heads of mission, for instance, had a seminar where we had invited Dr. Tedros of the World Health Organization, where again, we requested and we begged Canada to support the TRIPS waiver. Now, the TRIPS waiver is very important because it means countries that have the infrastructure can produce the vaccines in those countries. Then it will be easy to distribute. For instance, South Africa, we can do it. The proposal for the TRIPS waiver was done by South Africa, was put together by both South Africa and India. Both these countries are able to manufacture, to produce vaccines in these countries, but because of the TRIPS, the policy on trade and related intellectual properties. We cannot do it. So Canada can support that. They can support
Right.
waiver. We need that.
Very important. Finally, unfortunately, we don't have much time, High Commissioner, but you've been here for several years working very hard to build that relationship between Canada and South Africa. You know, tell me, what are your thoughts? A strong relationship, how can we build for the future? How do you feel about your years here as you get ready to head back?
Look, to be honest with you, all my time here in Canada, I have worked well with different stakeholders here in Canada, whether it's on issues, on women issues, education, universities. I have worked very, very well. It's only with the last week or so where I'm not so sure what is happening. But I think it's something that we will look into and be able to find solutions as soon as possible. But during my stay here, for instance, we have had very good relations with about 10 South African ministers, for instance, visiting Canada. In 2018, we had President Ramaphosa attending the G7 summit in Quebec. I've met with your former prime ministers, for instance, Brian Mulroney, where he spoke at one of my events. I've met with the former Prime Minister Joe Clark, and we have had engagements with premiers from different provinces. Also, in my other capacity, at some stage, I was for about 3 years, I was the chair of the Women Heads of Diplomatic Missions here in Canada. And I think during that period, we were very successful in engaging other women's groups. We collaborated on a number of areas. We did a lot with schools. We did a lot with, for instance, the Famous Five, Elevate, Women Elevate. We worked with the senators. And also, in my capacity as the High Commissioner of South Africa, I've hosted, for instance, events where there were seminars on women's issues, gender-based violence, where I partnered with senators to look into gender-based violence, where I invited the former UN woman, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. I've worked with the Chamber Canada, where we invited Wamkele Mnene to talk about possible relations between Canada and the Chamber and improving investment opportunities. I've chaired SADC. Like I said, about 2 weeks back, we brought in Dr. Tedros to talk about the TRIPS waiver. We were hoping that perhaps Canada will also engage, that's one, but unfortunately they could not engage for whatever reason, I don't know. But secondly, we also were hoping that the ministerial conference, which was to take place in Geneva, perhaps Canada would indicate support. Unfortunately, because of the latest variant, that meeting had to be postponed. So I've engaged with the diaspora. I've had very successful engagement with universities. We have formed very strong partnerships. And as we speak, I'm still going to be meeting with Queen's University next week. Last week, I met with McGill University and also Ottawa U. There are very brilliant programs that are coming up. I've written opinion pieces. The media has allowed me to write. I've written a lot of opinion pieces, articles on different subject matters, which for me was very, very useful. I must say, while I'm talking about the media, I've always been critical of the media, and I've had engagements with media houses, for instance, because I've never been happy of how they were reporting when it comes to Africa. But I must say, the last few weeks, I was very impressed about how the media reported on the Omicron. They were very objective, and they gave me a platform to speak, and the analysis that came out were really very objective. And I'm really, really impressed about how this whole issue, very sensitive issue, was handled. I have done a lot of webinars, this one being one of them, quite a number of webinars during both from 2020 when we started with COVID-19 up until now. It's been a lot on a number of issues. We have gone to schools, we have spoken about inclusiveness, embracing diversity. We have worked also on during Nelson Mandela Days. We have gone to shelters. We have worked with Joe to the Girl, for instance, feeding those families that needed to be fed. Personally, I have volunteered a lot at Ottawa Mission, peeling and dishing, cleaning, etc. So I think my time here, I have learned a lot and I have grown. Be it with the challenges confronting me, I would do it again. I accept whatever happened because it helped me to grow as a person.
That's wonderful. And thank you so much for joining us today, High Commissioner. And you've clearly put a lot of work and investment into building that relationship between Canada and South Africa, and not just in terms of the high level kinds of conversations and relationships, but even when you talk about working at the Ottawa Mission and working in terms of women and certainly violence and so on, your work speaks for itself. And we hope we see you again and see you back at some point. Canada will miss you, but it's been a pleasure talking with you today as part of our conference for the Pearson Center. Wish you all the best. Take care. And thank you, our audience, for joining us today. I wish I had more time to have this conversation with you, High Commissioner. It's been really informative and very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You take care.
Thank you.